Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be getting into Module 5, Part 1, where we're going to be discussing the lymphatic system. Okay, so the overall function of the lymphatic system is not usually one of the first systems that you would think about, but we absolutely require this system to support the cardiovascular system's function as well as our immune system's function. And without this lymphatic system, neither of those two major organ systems would be able to operate. So the function of the lymphatic system specifically is to help transport any escaped fluid that escapes from the cardiovascular system and get it back into circulation via the bloodstream. Plays an essential role in body defense and also helps fight off disease. And so that's the two ways in which which it supports both of those systems. The main structures that we're going to be discussing in our lecture today are going to be the lymphatic vessels themselves, the lymph, which is the lymphatic fluid that we'll discuss, and then the lymph nodes. Those are the main structures we'll talk about. And if you want to look over to this picture here, I did want to make sure that we knew or understood how this was set up so that we kind of get a feel for the integration of the lymphatic system with the cardiovascular, which is to say that the red is always going to be showing your oxygenated blood that's coming from the lungs and going to the heart and then to the rest of the body via your arteries. We know that well. The blue is showing that deoxygenated blood returning from the body via the veins, going back to the heart and then to the lungs and repeating the cycle. We know that well. So the green that we're now going to integrate is showing all of those lymphatic vessels, as well as some lymph nodes that we can see there. And those are intertwined throughout the capillary beds and end up sending lymph fluid to the heart. All right, so our main structures, again, we've got those lymphatic vessels. Those are our networks of drainage vessels. Those collect and return excess fluid to the blood. Okay, so it can definitely have an effect on overall blood volume and blood pressure. The lymph itself is the name that we give that excess tissue fluid and some of the circulating plasma proteins. And that's just the liquid that's actually being carried. You can think of that as that excess fluid that's being returned. And it's important to understand that a big part of this is if that fluid is not picked up and that excess fluid is not circulated throughout, then swelling or edema tends to occur if it accumulates in those tissues. And so we don't want excess edema. So the lymphatic system is who we have to thank for that as well. And then finally, we have our lymph nodes. These are those small organs that act as little checkpoints. They're just basically little filters along the way of those lymphatic vessels, and just basically continues to help filter out any sort of harmful or foreign substances as it returns into circulation. Contains your immune cells, such as macrophages and lymphocytes. And then we're going to finish by looking specifically at some other lymphoid organs. Those include your spleen, your thymus, tonsils, as well as some others. And we also have some tissues that are some key structures that also help with immune function as well. So it's kind of like breaking down the two sides of the lymphatic system, the side that specifically assists the cardiovascular and the side that specifically assists with the immune system. It's important to understand that these lymphatic vessels tend to form a one-way system, and it's always going to be pushing lymph, that excess tissue fluid, toward the heart to be recirculated and to return into the blood supply. This is going to begin in these little microscopic lymphatic capillaries. These are interwoven and intertwined between tissue cells themselves and our blood capillaries. And this structure is going to make them more permeable than blood capillaries. They easily take in larger particles so that they can help circulate these particles throughout, like proteins, cell debris. But it also happens to mean that they can take in large particles like pathogens and cancer cells. And so these can be specifically receptive to certain types of inflammation and cancer if those cancer cells choose to try to proliferate, and circulate through the lymphatic vessels. Really love this slide a lot, guys. This really shows you a sort of a full image here of how we actually get all of this excess fluid back to the heart. And so lymph is going to essentially move from that initial point of your lymphatic capillaries. It'll then move up into collecting lymphatic vessels. Okay, so those are just similar to your blood vessels. Then it's going to move as it goes through those vessels towards the heart. It's going to hit these little checkpoints called lymph nodes. This is just where that fluid gets filtered. All right, so each of those little nodes are just little checkpoint filters to further filter the fluid as it is about to return to circulation. And then it will ultimately arrive at the lymphatic trunks. These are just basically where they unite to now drain large areas of the body. And then they will ultimately arrive at one of two lymphatic ducts based on where they're coming from. If they're arriving at the right lymphatic duct, that means that they're taking or draining the lymph from the right upper limb, the right side of the head, and thorax. You can see this here in green, right? So all of this area right here is going to be drained by the right lymphatic duct via the internal jugular vein. And then the rest of the body, basically everything that's not that right side and thorax, lower body, and the left side of the body is going to be drained by what we call the thoracic duct via the subclavian vein is how that will get back to the heart there. Okay. All right, so by returning this excess fluid to the heart, the lymphatic vessels tend to play a role in obviously returning leaked proteins to the blood so we can recirculate and hopefully get some use out of those. They carry pathogens and cancer cells to the lymph nodes, hopefully to filter those cancer cells and to filter out those pathogens so that they are no longer circulating in the body. They can carry absorbed fat from the intestines to the blood, so they have a little bit of a digestive role there. And the lymphatic vessels, it's important to understand in terms of their structure, they're kind of like veins, right? They have really thin walls. Larger vessels will have valves to create that one-way system. And they still operate under low pressure, and they're pumpless, right? So this means that a lot of the things that physiologically the veins have to rely on, like the skeletal muscular pump or that thoracic pump from breathing and diaphragmatic pressure, it's going to rely on the same things in order to sort of milk that fluid in one direction towards the heart, especially against gravity if it's coming from the lower body. So these make up the lymphoid tissues, which make up lymphoid organs. Okay, so these lymphatic vessels, we want to make sure that the lymphoid cells are addressed as well. So the lymphoid cells are mainly immune system cells. Okay, the lymphocytes are the main warriors. We call those the main warriors of the immune system. Those are the key players. We also have T cells that directly attack invading substances and manage the immune system. The B cells secrete antibodies into the blood. Okay, so while the T cells are those direct attacker cells, the B cells are the ones that will actually just secrete antibodies, which can then help us recognize foreign substances. And then we have our macrophages. These phagocytize or just eat or engulf foreign substances and tend to also activate those direct attacker T cells. We also want to make sure that we understand that the lymphoid cells also include reticular cells. These happen to produce a fiber called stroma, creates a network to actually support the other cells within those lymphoid organs and tissues. So there's a lot going on here, but main thing to take away from this is that these lymphoid cells, they make up the lymphoid tissues, which make up the lymphoid organs. So it's always going to have these key roles in supporting immune system function, as it also supports the cardiovascular system function and returning that fluid to circulation. And now we're going to get into our lymphoid organs, the other key players in this system. So they're broken down into two functional groups. You can see all of them labeled and their relative locations in the diagram over here on the right. You've got your primary, what we would call primary lymphoid organs. These are your red bone marrow and your thymus. When I say primary, I mean initial in terms of your lifespan, initial contributors to this system. And then secondary are the ones that continue throughout your life and play key roles in this system. So remember, for primary, we've got our B cells, which happen to be made and happen to mature in the red bone marrow. T cells are made in the red bone marrow and mature in the thymus. And we'll talk about each of those as we move forward a little bit. Secondary lymphoid organs are very numerous. You've got your lymph nodes, your spleen, and all of the other mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, which is referred to as MALT for short. This includes your tonsils, your Peyer's patches, and the appendix. And then this is also where mature lymphocytes happen to be activated in all of those tissues. All right, so let's start with the lymph nodes. Those are key players. Those are your little checkpoint filters. So let's make sure that we understand what these are and what they do. They happen to be located along the lymphatic vessels throughout the body. The function of this is to cleanse the lymph fluid and to activate the immune system when necessary. So this is most important because it is the only way in which we can actually cleanse the lymph fluid. Okay, so this is a very, very important part to this. That's why you have so many of these checkpoints along all of your lymphatic vessels. We have dendritic cells, which are involved bringing antigens to lymph nodes. These are those components in your bloodstream that can help recognize something as foreign or other than. You have macrophages, which again engulf and destroy bacteria, viruses, other foreign substances. Those are in the lymph nodes. And then also you got your lymphocytes, which respond to foreign substances as well. And now I do want to make sure that we understand just how this works, right? Because we have fluid going through, right? These checkpoints, these nodes are along the vessels, and so it's kind of a one-way system. So how is it moving in and how is it moving out? Well, you've got the lymph fluid, which actually enters the convex side of these lymph nodes through what we call afferent vessels. You can also see, not for nothing, you can see that these vessels, being some of the larger ones, you can see how they actually have those little flap-like valve systems as well to prevent any sort of backflow. So we keep it in a one-way direction coming from those afferent vessels into the lymph node. And it's going to flow through all of these sinuses, and all of these sinuses are basically going to be full of all of those immune system cells, right? Your B cells, T cells, macrophages, etc. And then you've got the lymph that will exit through your efferent. On that concave side, you exit through that efferent. Again, you've got valves to prevent any backflow, but they're going to come in through afferent, be filtered out through all of those immune cells, and then go out through the efferent vessels. And it's important to understand that there happen to be a lot less efferent vessels than there are afferent. And that's a very, very important part of this, because it means that the flow, the overall flow, you're going to have more coming in than what can go out. And so it's going to end up working kind of like sand going through an hourglass, where it's going to slow the overall flow of this fluid, and it's going to give all of your immune cells within those nodes a lot more time to actually address and filter out any foreign substances that need to be addressed before we circulate them further. If we don't get them this time, no problem, because not very far in along this vessel, you're going to have another lymph node, okay? So very, very important players in this process. And now we're going to cover the remaining lymphoid organs. I gave you this slide. If you'd like to hit pause, you can feel free, or you can come back to this slide as you review. This is just showing you the relative location of all of these other lymphoid organs that we're going to cover, to include the tonsils, the thymus, the spleen, your Peyer's patches in your intestines, and the appendix. All right, and so we're just going to be going through these. They all play critical roles, and so we're just going to address, where you can find each of these lymphoid organs and what they do. Okay, so whenever I'm referring to the thymus, it's found overlying the heart, functions at peak levels during youth only. The function is, this is where your attacker T cells mature so that they can defend us against those pathogens when activated by an immune response. These have a very, very key role in early life, okay? So tend to be a lot less of a potent effect in adulthood, but still a very, very important player, because we don't get to adulthood without being able to ward off foreign substances and pathogens in our youth. We've got the spleen. You can see that and where that's located over here in the image on the right. This is located on the left side of the abdomen, kind of the anterolateral portion of the stomach, if you want to think of it that way, kind of coming around that interior lateral side. This is going to function in cleansing the blood and removing old or worn out red blood cells, other debris, foreign substances. These broken down red blood cells can be recycled or stored. So salvaged iron can be reused. Blood platelets, monocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. Not only can we break these down and reuse to make more of those that are not worn out, but we can also store them for later. And this is going to actually also have a role in activating and proliferating lymphocytes. And we have what we call like red pulp tissue and white pulp tissue that comprise the spleen. Main thing that we want to keep in mind here is just it's another way to cleanse, to repurpose and repackage, and a little bit of added storage for those blood cell components. And then we're going to get into that acronym MALT, MALT. This stands for, again, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So this is a set of lymphoid tissues located in mucous membranes throughout the body. And this functions to basically prevent pathogens from penetrating any sort of mucous membrane. It's also a site of lymphocyte activation and proliferation. So the lymphocytes that address these foreign substances are able to proliferate, to grow, and to mature, and to then be activated and called to action. The MALT organs themselves include the tonsils, the Peyer's patches, and the appendix. You can see their relative locations over here on the right. The tonsils are just this ring of tissues around the entrance of the pharynx that gathers and tries to remove any pathogens from food or inhaled air before they can actually enter the throat, the GI tract, the lungs, etc. They trap and remove bacteria and other pathogens before they get to those locations. And then sometimes they do their job so well that there tends to be a buildup of that bacteria. And whenever this happens and we have that inflammation, we call that tonsillitis. You can see an image of what normal and what inflamed or engorged or congested with bacteria might mean for a tonsil in the image below. You've got Peyer's patches, which are small clusters of this lymphoid tissue in the ileum of your small intestine that monitor intestinal bacteria, right? This is clearly a very common place where we might experience bacteria that is not normal or healthy gut bacteria, and so we want to be able to catch that before we circulate it further, and so we have these Peyer's patches in order to help us do that. They help prevent the growth of anything that is pathogenic, so that would lead to more serious conditions. And then we've got our appendix. So this is going to be where we contain a bunch of lymphoid tissue. It helps prevent bacteria from breaching intestinal walls and generating a sort of memory for certain types of bacteria and pathogens for our lymphocytes. And this helps establish more long-term immunity. And that is, I believe, going to be our last slide. So that's going to conclude the last of the lymphoid organs. We are now going to continue forward with Module 5 in the next part of this lecture with looking at our innate and our learned immunity. And so that will probably be broken down into another 2 parts, but the lymphatic system obviously plays such a key role. Understanding the background of that before getting into immune system is I would say a must. And I hope that you found this helpful. This will be a good bridge from our cardiovascular to our discussion on immune, and we'll see you at the next one.